Okay, and next we're going to examine Mr. Gray's treatment of Wrede and Renan. Okay, so Gray does mention one other Christian who was a critic of Paul for theological reasons, William Wrede. However, Gray does not place Mr. Wrede in the list of critics of Paul and does not quote Wrede's major criticisms. He includes only one cryptic critical reference. Rather, Gray discusses Wrede on the unrelated issue of whether Paul or Jesus was the true founder of Christianity. See Kindle location 2402. So in other words, Mr. Gray diverted attention and goes over to a different topic unrelated to his, or not directly related to the subject matter of anti-Paul critiques, and he's just asking the question, was Jesus the true founder of Christianity, or was Paul the true founder of Christianity? And so we'll continue then. Wrede is narrowly identified by Mr. Gray as someone who said Paul turned Christianity into a religion of redemption rather than one based on Jesus' ethical teachings. Wrede says this makes Paul the second founder of Christianity. This is quoted at the Kindle location 2402 of Wrede's book. Gray then drops in a critical quote of Wrede about Paul, and I mean critical in a good sense, about Paul, that this is, meaning it's critical about Paul, that this, quote, second founder of Christianity has even compared with the first, exercised beyond all doubt the stronger, not the better influence. Kindle location 2402. So that is including, therefore, Mr. Gray is including a negative statement by William Wrede about Paul being the second founder of Christianity, meaning Paul has exercised the first. He became the stronger, that Paul has exercised beyond all doubt the stronger but not the better influence. So in other words, William Wrede is saying, I prefer had Jesus had the influence, not Paul. So that is, Mr. Gray is allowing a negativity to be expressed by someone other than Nietzsche, Hitler, feminists, or George Bernard Shaw, famous socialist atheist. I mean, so now we're getting at least a little glimmer from a voice that's not in that category, but doesn't seem to be a hateful person. Okay, so at least we're getting some less than maniacal, evil people who hate Paul to be involved here now. All right, but the surrounding context in Gray's discussion is all involved in whether Jesus or Paul is the primary influence over the church. So this is a very slight indication of what was a major critique of Paul by Wrede, a Lutheran seminary student. So now I'm going to ask the question, which is what I think Mr. Gray should have done, my critique here. What was Wrede's critique that Gray never mentions? Wrede's work, it's entitled Paul, very simple, unassuming title, 1901, said that Paul never quotes Jesus, but once or twice, and by the way, that's re-quoting the what do you call it, the communion liturgy. He quotes that, and he has one or two other quotes. The worker is worthy of his wage. It's arguable it isn't or isn't, but okay, so what? Maybe he has some knowledge of Jesus, some of Jesus' words from the Gospels, but he really shows no knowledge or familiarity with Jesus of the Gospels at all. So you've just got the communion liturgy, the worker is worthy of his wage, maybe one or other two things, but there is no unique quotes of Jesus. And so this is what Wrede's point is. So he says, that Paul never quotes Jesus but once or twice, and thus was not a true disciple of Jesus. If we want to be Christian, we have to return to Christ. So says Wrede. As a result, meaning if you stick with Paul and you read Paul, you never learn anything about Jesus, what he teaches. You would never know he taught a sermon. You would never know anything from the Sermon on the Mount. You wouldn't know anything about how to live that Jesus would command you to do. You would only be hearing what Paul's teaching you. So Wrede says, as a result of this, so he said, we have to return back to Christ. So says Wrede. I mean, it's a simple premise of a book. I mean, he does this in a couple hundred pages, but I mean, that is the gist of this book. As a result, Wrede's work led in Germany to the Back to Jesus from Paul movement in the decades that followed. And so he wrote in 1901, but someone had to step all over him and destroy his success, and that was a guy named Rudolf Bultmann. Rudolf Bultmann quashed this movement in 1929 by saying Paul's teachings supersede the teachings of Jesus in the flesh prior to his ascension. That is, all of Jesus' earthly preaching is gone because Paul was communicating with the ascended Jesus. By the way, this sounds extremely pagan if you ask me. Like someone is channeling somebody else. He can't quote him. He won't quote him because he can't quote him. He's been told you can't quote what you're hearing in the third heaven. That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 7, or 12, chapter 12. Just look at that. So he can't say anything that's happening, but you're supposed to just understand he's somehow when he's communicating, somehow Jesus is communicating through him, although he can't quote him. It's illicit. Paul teaches us, Bultmann said, that we are to no longer know Christ through Jesus' teachings in the flesh, citing 2 Corinthians 5:16. See our article discussing this at this link. Yes. So Germany, to pave the way, what paved the way for Nazism was the elimination of Christ from Christianity. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer said these principles that basically taught that Jesus' words no longer mattered were part of the reasons why Germans have no more soul. They gave up Christ. They were no longer. It was a Christian. He called it a Christianity without Christ, because there's no more discipleship. You're not training people to follow Christ anymore. You don't take out anything in the Sermon on the Mount. You don't take any of his parables, any of his lessons, any of his teachings, and then start training people. This is what you need to do. You're in this situation. You have a dispute with a brother. You and him have to talk it out. Jesus says, go to your brother and tell him what you have as a problem with. Let him deal with you and him directly. Don't go to his mother and complain to his mother and try to get her to be involved. No, go to your brother and talk to your brother and find out what you need to do to resolve the dispute with him. That's what Jesus said. And if you can't do that, there are other mechanisms. You can go to the church. You can ask some higher person of a spiritual nature inside your community of fellowship and ask that person, can you intervene here and talk to this person, because I seem not to be getting through to that person. So Jesus gave us a way of what we call dispute resolution. But with Paul, you have none of that. You just don't have any of it. Paul says, rather be defrauded than work anything out. Just you know what, you stole money from me, but I don't care. Nah. Nobody acts like that, Paul. It's ridiculous. People feel there's an injustice, and to let somebody steal money from you is not fair, and so you should speak up and say, hey, you owe me money. And if I need to, I would bring along a friend of mine to say, from the church, can you talk to him and tell him this has gone on long enough, he's got to pay me back, or whatever it is. But so, Paul's world is just, an unrealistic world. We're all just going to, just let people rob us blind. I mean, that kind of Christianity would die out really fast, by the way. I mean, it hasn't died out. No, I'm not saying it has, but it will. Paul said two things that will kill Christianity that none of us follow. And one of them was, men, the time is so short. This is 1 Corinthians 7, I think. Men, the time is so short. Those who are married should live now as if they are not married. And he means stop having sexual relations with your wife. That's what he means, because it's too much of a distraction. And he says that in context, In fact, that's why he says don't get married. It's just too much time and energy spent on something that's, you got to focus on God, right? So really what Paul was saying is stop procreating. That's, the time is short. Time is at hand. 1 Corinthians 7, time is at hand. You married men must now live as you don't have a wife. And the other thing he said, it would be, and any community, is that if one person's robbing from another person in the community, they can't bring it up. Rather suffer being defrauded than do anything about it. Just okay. It's not realistic. Anyway, so this William Wrede thing is a big mistake to not have included. And just to mention him in terms of whether Paul is the second founder or another founder of Christian theology is really meaningless. We want to know, what was his point? Did it impact history? Oh, yes. What was the counterpunch? The counterpunch was dispensationalism, and it destroyed the German soul, according to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And they ended up with a Christianity without Christ. That's why the Nazis were able to take control of their country, because they had killed off Jesus' words, and they were now all following Paul. I mean, Bonhoeffer doesn't hide anything. Well, he does in a way. He doesn't try to be too blunt. But he was trying to say, yeah, this doctrine created, we have no discipleship anymore. And that's why he called it the cost of discipleship. He was trying to say, when you have faith alone, and that's all you have, you have no more discipleship, because you've made it irrelevant or unnecessary to be discipled at all, because you're already saved. Why would you need to be discipled if you've already won the golden prize? It just doesn't make any sense to a rational person You tell me I'm saved just by believing in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Now you want me to follow Jesus? I don't have to do that. You just told me I'm going to heaven, so I'm just going to go have fun and play around and just do whatever I want. Who are you people? Don't you even listen to what you're teaching me? I'm going to heaven on faith alone. I'm guaranteed heaven. You said so. Goodbye. So this is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer was saying. We have planted the seeds for our own destruction, and the Nazis were what rose out of the debris. And in 1937, he wrote the book Cost of Discipleship to try to rescue his country, but it was a little too late. Bultmann had already destroyed William Wrede's movement. But William Wrede's movement was the last chance for the Germans to stay on the right course and get back on track. And they were there. They were on their way from 1901, 02 to 1927 when Bultmann just blew it all up. Okay, let me cover. Well, let me see how long this was. This was 10 minutes. Okay, so I'll do the next one really fast. So we'll cover one more person. All right, and now this is a kind of a funny one too. Don't understand Mr. Gray's analysis here. So Ernest Renan. Ernest Renan was a teacher of boys at a boys' school in France. He was going to go into Catholic orders. He decided to become an independent theologian. He really aligns more with Protestantism than he does with anything else. But he's sort of I don't want to say free thinker. That gives you the wrong idea. I mean, he believes in God. And he believes in Jesus' teachings and all of that. But he's very independently minded how he analyzes things. I don't agree with anything he says, but I can summarize him without getting upset. Okay. And he also identified what he believes are very anti-Paul statements in the epistles and the Gospels, but he believes it was put there by hatred. So the problem I have with how Gray handles this is he actually says that Ernest Renan is. Listen to this. Gray refers to Ernest Renan as unambiguously anti-Pauline. Kindle 2960. I don't know where he gets this, and it's footnote 8. I don't know where he gets this idea unambiguously anti-Pauline. No. He is summarizing anti-Pauline remarks that he reads in the book of Revelation, James and Jude in particular, and then he calls it all hatred. So he is disputing that it was validly true. So that means he's pro-Paul, not anti-Paul. Now, on the other hand, just to play devil's advocate here so I'm complete, is he does say, Renan says, but I'm going to tell you my personal preference is I'm going to follow Jesus, and Paul is sort of a hidden rock that has caused many of us to trip over, and basically that's not a good thing. Tripping over someone means he's kind of misleading you. So he's going to not reject Paul, but he's not like super excited about Paul. Yet his books are called Paul. That's the name of the book, St. Paul. So his hero is sort of someone he's still at the same point, likes him, still believes in him, but doesn't want to follow him, wants to follow Jesus. So that actually, I think that's the most honest position you will ever find somebody saying, I can, despite all of my love and allegiance to Paul, and I'm going to write a whole book on Paul. By the end of this book, I'm going to actually tell you the truth. I think we're better off following Jesus. That's what he does say. But at the same token, he's not anti-Paul. He's just being pro-Jesus, where he's got to let go of Paul in the end of this book. I think it was a book of discovery for him. So I don't think he started out coming to this conclusion. It's as he went, he came around, and that's how he concluded his book. But anyway, let's read what I have here. Gray never quotes or cites what work is supposedly anti-Paul by Ernest Renan. So I'm guessing it's the work I'm telling you about. So that's another omission. So really, if you're a scholar or you want to help people, you should tell people what book you're referencing. That's just normal courtesy. Regardless, I strongly disagree with his conclusion. Renan is pro-Paul as an ordinary man, meaning Paul is an ordinary man, without any hate. There's no hate at all for Paul, not at all. And he's the loudest critic of anti-Paulinism. So this is what's so ironic about Mr. Gray. So my feeling is Mr. Gray did not ever read Mr. Renan. He just superficially read him. And if you read him out of context, you think he's saying that when he's quoting James as anti-Paul, or he quotes second chapter of Revelation as anti-Paul, you think he's agreeing with that if you don't read the whole context. So you can't skim people. You have to actually read what they're saying to understand in context. He's totally pro-Paul, and he fights Paulinism, anti-Paulinism. He would be saying, Doug, I disagree with you 100%. You don't understand. All these verses that you're citing from Jesus and from James and from Jude, these people hate Paul. They're just Jesus hates Paul, Jude hates Paul, James hates Paul, or the apostles who put words in Jesus' mouth, they hate Paul. Whatever it is, they're just haters. So this is the stereotype that Mr. Gray wanted to perpetuate. He should have actually pulled all these quotes out and would have helped his case that people sometimes believe that these statements in Scripture are due to hatred. You see what I mean? So in other words, this shows you what a lot of people try to do to dismiss anti-Paulinism is attribute it to hatred, and now you've delegitimized it. So they don't even have an objective reason. They're not using the principle of apostasy, for example, to determine, is Paul belonging in Scripture? Is he teaching against the law? If he is an apostate. We have to remove him. It's just unemotional. It's just a simple conclusion of law. He's anti-law. He goes. He's gone. That's it. You don't have to don't have to hate him. Just simply remove him. That's the decision in front of all Christianity right now. We have to remove Paul for the good of all the children who's reading him and the horrible things he says, and his being an anti-law person. He just doesn't belong anymore. We have to get rid of him in our scriptures, as inspired scriptures. We need to put him in a section called the apostate section or the heretic section, something that will warn people opening and turning the page that this is the apostate. This is the guy who tried to destroy Christ's message and create dispensationalism and all kinds of horrible isms to get rid of Jesus. Okay, anyway, let's keep reading. Renan attacks Revelation as written as a cry of hatred. So the book of Revelation I've already discussed that with you all, as there's references to Jesus condemning the teacher, someone who says he's an apostle and isn't. He condemns someone who teaches you can eat meat sacrificed to idols, and Jesus says he's the new Balaam in the New Testament era, and the new Balaam would be somebody who was on the side of a road, and he basically gets visited on the side of the road, and his donkey starts talking to him. I mean, there's all kinds of similarities between Paul's experience and Balaam, but Balaam also taught you can eat meat sacrificed to idols. Renan also slanders James and all the apostles as shallow-minded in their epistles against Paul. Renan, St. Paul, at volume 2, page 220 and 301. So if you click these buttons, you go to this webpage, which is called Book Review of Gray, Paul is a Problem in History. You will find all these links, and you can do your own research. He further accused the apostles of trying to destroy Paul's work by insult and calumny, page 221. So again, he's attributing anti-Paulinism only to hatred. He apparently doesn't know about the apostasy principle, and that would make him not understand what's going on here. Meaning a neutral, objective conclusion. This rejection of anti-Paulinism he recognized from Jewish Christian leaders of the early church, in line with Renan's view in his prior work called The Life of Jesus. And in that book, called The Life of Jesus, Renan said Jesus purified himself of Jewish traits and was transformed from a Jew into a Christian. Ernest Renan. I concluded that so you can understand, talk about free thinking. I mean, he came up with that. To me is a wild idea. Like, Jesus is no longer a Jew. He's a free thinker. He can think outside the box, and he's not defining himself as a Jew at all. I don't know where that came from, but that's what he says. So you can just realize he's a bit of a wackadoo. But he's definitely attributing anti-Paulinism to hatred. So he gives me an example of somebody who mischaracterizes anti-Paulinism, who himself is unbalanced spiritually, and he could reach a conclusion like this about Jesus. Jesus is like the first Christian. That's what he's really saying, and he was no longer a Jew. Come on, this is just childish stuff. But it's obviously false. But that's what Renan said. But he was extremely popular and very influential in America and in Europe and England, and he was French, and so I presume in his own home country and his own language. At the same time, Renan is Jesus-centric without criticizing Paul with any hateful remark. Thus, it is true that Renan believes Paul has been a hidden rock Okay, so he says this. Maybe I should open this up. And it's caused many to fall off the path of following Jesus. So actually, let's open this up. Let's see what we can find out. Oh, darn it. They don't do... Google has changed the way you can open up pages anymore. And it used to, in the old days, you open up the book to a page. Anyway, you can go there. It's page 330. And Paul had an honest belief, he says, that he heard revelations from Jesus, although Renan said that they were truly from Paul's imagination. So see, he likes Paul. Paul's his hero. That's why he's writing a book about St. Paul. But he's also being kind of honest. But is that really true? I tend to believe that he is really talking to somebody, and I don't believe it's Jesus. So you use your own imagination of who that likely should be or could be. But he does not fault Paul for this error on our part. Rather, Renan said it was always our obligation to follow the clear words of Jesus in the Gospels, not including the book of Revelation, which he just attributes to hatred, that shine brightly and clearly as our guide, and not only in early Christianity, but now more than ever. Thus, Renan implies that we are in the wrong by putting attention on Paul's feebly expressed words, the hidden rock, over the clear message from Jesus. So, you see, if you look at the page numbers, look at what page this happens on, page 330. Look what he's saying at page 220 and 301. I believe he wrote this book on the fly, meaning he didn't know where he was going. And he says all these things that the Anti-Paulinism in the earlier books are all to promote, to attack Paul from hatred. But now he's getting to the end of the book, and what does he say? Paul is a hidden rock. I believe this is what he eventually decided how he's going to reconcile all this stuff. And that's what he did. So that to me is, it's just my sense. I can't prove it. In other words, he could have had that conclusion before he wrote the book, but I think he came to that conclusion right where he wrote it down. So Renan is both pro-Paul and Jesus-centric. But if you read the book in chronological terms, he was extremely pro-Paul initially. He then hurled all kind of hatred in order to at the apostles, James, Jude, even the words of Jesus, presumably really spoken by somebody put in Jesus' mouth, I would imagine, is what Renan was implying. But when it really came down to it, he started to realize, you know what? Even though I wrote this book about Paul, I'm going to switch gears and I'm going to tell people I think we need to be Jesus-centric. So I actually think what you're witnessing is a conversion from pro-Paulinism to moderate Jesus-centric anti-Paulinism. And so you couldn't find a person who's more loving and worshipful of Paul until you get to Renan, and then you see it literally switches in the middle of a book. Okay, so I'm going to pause here, and then I'm going to come right back. Okay, so so in conclusion here on Renan. So Renan is both pro-Paul. This is clearly until he switches to being Jesus-centric at the very end of the book. It was seemingly like a conversion happening in real time as he's writing. Not only is Renan not unambiguously anti-Pauline, but also he's not conceivably anti-Pauline. If Renan is anti-Pauline for simply making Jesus' words more important than Paul's words, then by that standard, Jesus would be anti-Pauline too by merely saying the apostle is not greater than the one who sends him. John 13:16. I take it that in Gray's book, that is not what he means by being anti-Pauline. I mean, it can't just be simply, I'm choosing Christ over Paul. I'm now therefore an anti-Paulinist. I haven't even expressed anything negative about Paul. So he's never expressed anything negative about Paul, except he said he's a hidden rock, whatever that means, that he can trip over and fall and stumble. That's what he seems to be saying, which means he could be, just like 2 Peter says, difficult to understand, can mislead you, can fall into trouble, but he's not said anything truly that negative. I mean, that's not a real big deal. Lastly, the irony of Ernest and Renan is he cites all the anti-Paul remarks in James, Jude, and Revelation and deflects them all as due to hate. Renan never embraces them as truth. This is simply Renan's honest recognition of an obvious canon source criticism about Paul, even if Renan's rebuttal relies upon an obvious ad hominem smear, the same smear that I think other people give anti-Paulinists. Oh, well, we don't have to listen to them. They're full of hate. such canonical source criticism of Paul. Renan then endorses Jesus' words in the Gospels as our primary focus, without criticizing Paul in any significant way, except gently saying Paul is a hidden rock, which we sometimes trip over. This makes Renan unique among all Christian writers. While he is extremely opposed to anti-Paulinism, Renan is still also objective enough to be extremely Jesus-centric. Okay, so that's a very good thing. And now we're going to go into a couple more things. So I got to show you a couple more things that Mr. Gray did not cover, and that we need to know what he missed, and that he needs to put in the next version.